IBESS, Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Part 3, will pick up where Part 2 left off with an examination of processes that degrade soil. The significant ideas are fertile soils require significant time to develop through the process of succession, and secondly, human activities may reduce soil fertility and increase soil erosion. Here is the first of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Here is the second of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. Here is the IB syllabus statement that picks up from Part 2. Outline the processes and consequences of soil degradation. Soil degradation results from erosion, salinization, toxification, desertification, and a general loss of fertility resulting from deforestation, agricultural practices, and urbanization. This movie will look at salinization, toxification, desertification, and this loss of fertility at the end. Before moving into salinization, here's an IB syllabus statement to read carefully, take notes. Human activities that can reduce soil fertility include deforestation, intensive grazing, urbanization, and agricultural practices that include irrigation, the monoculture, the growth of single species across wide tracts of land, the use of pesticides and herbicides. As well, you need to be able to discuss the influences of human activities on soil fertility and soil erosion. In terms of human activities, let's first look at salinization. Salinization is the accumulation of salts in soil, and this accumulation can eventually make soil unable to support plant growth. Over-irrigation in agriculture causes salinization. You can see salinization in this photo. The white crystals on the surface of the soil are salt. Here is another photo of salinization, a form of soil degradation that's more likely to occur in arid areas where the rates of evaporation are high. With salinization, the accumulation of salts in soil, this can eventually make soil unable to support plant growth. This reduces soil fertility. Over-irrigation causes salinization. When the fresh water is spread onto a farm field, it contains trace amounts of salt. As water evaporates, the salts are left behind. As the process of irrigation is repeated year in and year out, more and more salts accumulate. Salinization results from irrigation. Salinization results in a loss of productivity as plants cannot tolerate salty soils. Soil biota disappear. The soil becomes less fertile. Now let's look at toxification. Toxification is the accumulation of toxic molecules, such as pesticides and herbicides, in the soil because of agriculture mostly. Industrial agricultural methods, as seen in these photographs, include the spraying of herbicides and pesticides that will ultimately accumulate in the soil. This is toxification. The consequences of toxification are a loss of productivity. Rivers or groundwater become polluted with the herbicides or pesticides. There's a loss of diversity that goes along with this pollution. And lastly, the pesticides or the herbicides end up in the food chain, initially bioaccumulation, and then these molecules magnify up the food chain. So far, we've looked at erosion. That was in Part 2. Remember, this is Part 3. We've looked at salinization, and we've looked at toxification. Now, let's look at desertification. Always remember that fertile soils contain a community of organisms that work to maintain functioning nutrient cycles. Fertile soils are resistant to erosion. Desertification, a process that is evident in this photograph, is the conversion of rangeland or cropland to a desert-like land with a drop in agricultural productivity of 10% or more. Desertification comes about due to overharvesting, overgrazing, an overuse of the land, an exhaustion of the land. Desertification is an enlargement of deserts due to human activities, intensive grazing particularly. With desertification, there is a loss of productivity, a loss of soil biota, and erosion increases. Here in this photograph from Mali, we can see desertification, over-harvesting, intensive grazing, overuse. It's an exhaustion of the land with accompanying loss of productivity, a loss of soil biota, and an increase in erosion. Here is another photograph of desertification in Mali. These are lands that are arid in the first place, and arid lands suffer the most from desertification. In this photograph, you can see a millet field, or maybe better said, a former millet field. Desertification is the conversion of rangeland or cropland to desert-like land with a drop in agricultural productivity of 10% or more. And I'd like you to consider how desertification would serve to increase erosion. If there is an over-harvesting, an overuse, and intensive grazing, there will likely be desertification. With desertification, there is a loss of productivity and an increase in erosion, thus more loss of productivity. Positive feedback. Intensive grazing. How much is too much? It's not an easy answer. Intensive grazing or overgrazing can appear to be different in different countries. Consider the biome, consider the people population densities, consider the local productivity, the carrying capacity of the land. So we've looked at the following processes that result in degraded soil. We've looked at erosion, salinization, toxification, desertification, and now we turn our attention to a loss of fertility, which includes deforestation, agricultural practices, and urbanization. And you should notice the overlap of loss of soil fertility with all of the other processes that degrade soil. As we dig into soil fertility and the processes that influence soil fertility, remember we're not looking specifically at erosion here, but we do need to consider erosion and more. In the slides to follow, we are looking at the processes that reduce soil fertility. So for example, deforestation impacts soil fertility because with deforestation, the nutrient and water holding capacity of the soil has been reduced. Water does not properly infiltrate and percolate through the soil. Instead, water moves quickly across the soil and through the soil, taking nutrients with it. Soil fertility is reduced by deforestation not only because of erosion, but also because the nutrient and water holding capacity of the soil has been reduced. Water does not properly infiltrate and percolate through the soil. Water moves quickly across the soil and through the soil, taking nutrients with it. Following deforestation, the soil hardens due to exposure, overexposure to the sun. The soil becomes dry and hard in a process known as laterization. This results in reduced productivity. Now we move on to look at how agricultural practices reduce soil fertility, specifically looking at intensive grazing, the monoculture, and irrigation. Intensive grazing is the overgrazing of plants that reduces the plant cover on the land, making the soil more likely to be eroded. With intensive grazing by domesticated animals comes reduced productivity, reduced soil fertility. Too many animals on too small a land area results in the compaction of soil, the trampling, and this reduces the soil biota. Soil is more easily eroded, and nutrient cycling is less when we have overgrazing, intensive grazing. Thus, reduced productivity occurs because of reduced soil fertility. Industrial agriculture is a monoculture, vast tracts of land growing a single species, very, very low diversity. Monocultures reduce soil fertility for a variety of reasons, one of which is that a single species extracts specific nutrients. The soil becomes deplete of those nutrients, those specific nutrients that are required by the monoculture. Monocultures require large quantities of herbicides and pesticides, and these toxins kill soil biota. Thus, the soil does not have the proper decomposition of organic matter or the proper nutrient cycling. Now, hopefully you're making the connections here. Monoculture, toxification, soil fertility. Irrigation reduces soil fertility not only because of increased rates of erosion, but because irrigation causes increased leaching of nutrients out of the upper horizons of the soil profile, out of reach of the plant roots. As well, irrigation causes salinization of the soil. Salty soil reduces productivity. Soil biota do not tolerate salt well, so the soil is less rich with biota following salinization. The soil is less fertile. Hopefully you're making the connections: irrigation, toxification, salinization, and soil fertility. If you've ever looked out the window of a plane and noticed beautiful green circles on the surface of the earth, you've been looking at irrigated lands. The green circle is plant growth resulting from irrigation that promotes the growth. The areas not green, as seen here, are arid and not productive without water. Now, salinization resulting from irrigation is more likely to occur in arid lands where evaporation rates are high. We've looked at the following processes that result in degraded soil: erosion, salinization, toxification, desertification, and a loss of fertility that comes from deforestation, agricultural practices such as intensive grazing, monoculture, and irrigation. Lastly, let's look at the loss of fertility that arises from urbanization. First things first, soil as natural capital that might serve the role of producing food or other valuable natural income is being lost to urbanization. When the natural environment is disturbed to put up buildings, as can be seen here, erosion increases. When the natural environment is disturbed in the process of urbanization, as can be seen here, erosion increases. Urban areas typically involve large construction sites, as can be seen in this photograph, and there are regions with uncovered or loose soil, and this increases erosion. The development of urban areas typically involves deforestation, loss of natural habitat, as can be seen here, and regions with uncovered or loose soil results in increased erosion. Once again, urban areas are developed following deforestation and typically involve large construction sites with regions of uncovered or loose soil, increasing rates of erosion. Urbanization disturbs soil integrity. Landslides are more likely to occur in urban areas, especially when soils must support structures, such as buildings or roads. And lastly, you can see evidence of urbanization in southern Spain from 1974 on the left to the year 2000 on the right. What you see is a change in the density of greenhouses to provide food. To provide the water for this urbanization, Spain built 118 dams and 22 water transfer projects. What became of the soil? Through the last two parts of the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production series, we've looked at the processes that result in the degradation of soil. We've looked at erosion, salinization, toxification, desertification, and the loss of fertility that comes from deforestation, agricultural practices, all three, and urbanization. And that brings us to the end of Soil and Terrestrial Food Production, Part 3.